All right, so we had another interesting week in the markets. Stocks actually opened down. Monday was kind of a bad day. Tuesday, I believe, we were down as well. But then Friday, later in the day, we did rally. The S&P was still down on the week, a little less than 100 basis points. NASDAQ was down, I think, over 200. The Meg 7 was down like 4 or 5%. So depending on where you were at in the markets, it was a good week or a bad week. Mid caps were about even. Small caps were down a little bit. The equal weight index was roughly flat. So it was a bad week for the growth side of the markets. First things first, though, if you get value out of the video, please like, subscribe. Check out those links below. Very much appreciate the support. So first things first, I wanted to get into here. MicroStrategy is less than 1,000 Bitcoin away from owning 500,000 Bitcoin. And I think that this is a very big moment, because we will look back on this. I mean, I've said this time and time again, but we're going to look back on this and people are going to be like, this was the most genius business thing that has ever been done. Arguably, possibly the greatest business move, because Bitcoin is at, what, 85 to 90,000 at the time of me making this. We corrected down just below 80,000. We're back up nicely from that. And what people need to realize is that what happens when Bitcoin's a million? What happens when it's 10 million, right? Like MicroStrategy's, their current market cap is around, I think, 60 billion. So when Bitcoin is a million, that would imply it's going to be right around 700 billion when it's at 10 million. And again, I'm assuming this goes there. Obviously, I don't know for sure it's going to happen, but I'm confident, but obviously I could be wrong. That would imply they're like a $7 trillion company. I mean, right now, the largest company by market cap is like, what, 3.5 trillion? So it depends how long that takes, but I think that probably between 5, 10, maybe 15 million a coin, MicroStrategy could very well be the largest company in the world. I mean, this is something that I've said before, and I think it very much could happen. So keep an eye out for this, because we are still very much at the early stages of this. And we will only ever have 21 million Bitcoin, and I believe a couple million of those, give or take, are lost. So MicroStrategy already owns more than 2%. They're probably closing in on 3% of the Bitcoin that will ever exist. And it's not far off that they will own more than any country or any entity for that matter. I mean, BlackRock probably, I think they own more, but as BlackRock technically has never shown proof of reserves, but I frankly, I don't think they're lying, but obviously I could be wrong about that. But speaking of BlackRock, they have just updated their recommendations, saying BlackRock adds Bitcoin to its model portfolio for the first time. So they are now recommending I believe it's a 2% allocation to Bitcoin. And this is just getting started. I mean, very like countries own very little. Sovereign wealth funds are just starting to buy. Pension funds are just starting to buy. Like I've said time and time again that we're still in the early innings here, and not to mention there's still my big timing for this is going to be once the boomers start to, once they're all retired and are starting to die in mass. And it's not that I'm happy that it happens, don't get me wrong, but it's inevitable, right? People die. So once they start, I mean, they're already retiring, but once they're all retired and they're starting to die at a higher rate, that's when things are really going to change, because that's the last generation of people that are stuck in the old mindset, and that's the 60-40 bonds and stocks. They're big into real estate. They're big into gold. I think that's another thing that people don't realize, is that what happens when the Gen Zers and what's the generation even after that? Like, what happens when they start to inherit all this gold and stuff? It's like a lot of that's going to get sold, and crypto, mainly Bitcoin, is going to be bought. So I still think we're very early on. And another thing that people need to realize as well is that if you want to get these crazy good returns from Bitcoin, like, you're going to have to survive the volatility. Like, this is nothing. Like, this is not that big of a deal. If you're truly in it for the philosophy, for the long-term gains, then who cares what the price does here? If you're in it to get rich quick, well, frankly, I think you're in it for the wrong reasons. And you might as well go to the casino. You might as well gamble on altcoins. You might as well gamble on options, because I don't think Bitcoin's the way to go. If your goal is to get rich slowly, and you're a long-term thinker, well, yeah, I think Bitcoin's a great option. Because, and think of it this way, if Bitcoin wasn't a good option, like, why is BlackRock recommending a one, like, they're only doubling down on their allegiance to Bitcoin. Like, if Bitcoin wasn't a good investment, why would the largest asset manager in the world become steadily more bullish over the last couple of years? Like, look, it doesn't make any sense. If they're becoming steadily more bullish, like obviously more bullish over the last couple of years, like 4 or 5 years ago, it was unthinkable that they would come up with an ETF, or they would be recommending to invest in it. Now, technically, they're recommending to invest in the ETF, but that's besides the point. That would be unthinkable. But now that's normal. That's something that it's barely even questioned. So we are very much still in the early innings, I think. A lot of people I know are disappointed at the recent pullback in price, but you have to keep in mind that there's only one really big piece of news, and Bitcoin could be up 20, 30, 40% in a week. Like, people don't seem to realize that we could go from 80, 90,000 to 110, 120, 130 in a week. A month for sure, but even a week. Like, what happens if the government comes out and says, yeah, we're creating a sovereign wealth fund, and 50% of it's going to be in Bitcoin? What happens if they say, hey, we're selling off a percentage of the gold, then we're going to buy Bitcoin? Like, all of those things are smart ideas. So what makes you think they're not going to do something? I think it is inevitable that we go this way. And it's not that Bitcoin needs governments to be successful. Like, it absolutely does not need governments. But when you have the best investment in the world, it's only a matter of time until governments get interested. It's only a matter of time until all the wealth managers in the world are forced to recommend it. Because, I mean, frankly, a lot of these, this is another way of thinking about it. Like, if you're a money manager and you don't, like, allocate money in a way to maximize profitability, you can get sued. Like, you can quite literally get sued. I mean, it's the classic, fiduciary duty, I believe, is the way that it's described, is that you are legally required to maximize returns for people. Now, again, obviously there's a risk aspect of it, but I don't think anybody, like any sane, reasonable person, would argue that a 2% allocation to Bitcoin is too risky. Like, no sane person would argue that. Frankly, I would say 5 or 10%. No sane person would argue either, but 2% absolutely for sure. So big things are happening. In my opinion, this is probably the last pullback before we see a nice run higher. But you also have to keep in mind that, hey, if the economy really starts to weaken, that very well could mean that maybe it's 6 months or a year before we see another high. Nobody knows. But personally, I'm confident that it's only a matter of time until we see another big run-up. And a lot of times before the big run-ups, you see these sell-offs to shake out the weak hands. And frankly, I would rather get lower returns, like personally, if that means that the people that just want to gamble, the people that are just in it to get rich quick, if it means that those people lose their money. Like, that is absolutely A-okay with me, because if you're not in it for the long run, if you're not in it for the philosophy, you don't deserve it in the end. So that's just my 2 cents there. So, like I mentioned with the stock markets, stocks were actually, the broader market as a whole was down. The S&P was down a little less than 1%. The NASDAQ was down over 2%. But we did close the week up nicely. And I think the big question is, Do we trend back up, or do we trend back down? And frankly, I became skeptical about a major breakout in stocks. I just think that there's too much risk going forward to see a major breakout. I still think we could easily see an all-time high, though. That we're within striking distance of that, so that's distinctly possible. But do I see 6,500 or 7,000 on the S&P in the near future? To me, that's just doubtful. I think that we might break 2-3% above of the recent high, but do we get 5-10% above? To me, in the near future, I just think that's not possible. But in the next year, 2, 3, 4, yeah, it's definitely possible. But another thing that I've heard a lot recently is the Trump administration seems less concerned about the stock market than they traditionally have, at least last time. So that's something that definitely is concerning, and that's one of the reasons that I'm definitely a little bit pessimistic on the stock market going forward. Not that I'm not buying; I'm buying almost at the exact same rate as I was 6 months or a year ago, but I'm careful, and I'm definitely tempering my expectations. So, getting into earnings from this past week, we did basically have the last major earnings week of the season. Nvidia was the big one. Nvidia, they beat earnings and revenue. However, their guidance was a little bit shaky, and they were actually down quite significantly on the week. I've said time and time again, I think Nvidia is just way too expensive. They are a phenomenal company. I mean, their metrics are extremely impressive, but they're just too expensive. And whenever you have a market that's this risky or this risk adverse, these kind of companies just aren't going to do good. So the next one is Domino's. Domino's was kind of an interesting one. They actually missed earnings and revenue, although they were up quite significantly on the week, like quite significantly. So I didn't read up too much on them, but I'm assuming that they actually issued fairly strong guidance, which is probably why they are up quite significantly on the week. The next one in the news here, Owens Corning. They beat earnings and revenue. This is one I have on a watch list. I used to own it, but I don't own it at the moment. BWXT, this is another one that I have on a watch list. I do not own. They beat earnings and revenue. This is in kind of the nuclear space, which is why I watch it. HIMS is a stock that's been in the news a lot recently. They were up a lot. They were back down again. They were up, and I think upwards around $70 a share. They came back down to about the low 50s. They sold off quite significantly on their earnings news. They actually did miss earnings, so that would explain that. Although they did close the week up, although they were still down as a whole. This is one I do have on a watch list, though. T-Rex beat earnings and revenue, another one I have on a watch list that I may or may not buy in the future. Home Depot is one that is watched for obvious reasons. Beat earnings and revenue. They did lower guidance a little bit, but it looks like they're actually up on the week, which is kind of surprising there. Bank of Montreal, obviously watching it because I am Canadian. They beat earnings and revenue. They were up quite significantly on that news, although they did sell off as the week went on, but they did still close the week up. Bank of Nova Scotia, similar story here, beat earnings and revenue. They were actually down slightly on the week. I believe their numbers weren't quite as good, so that would explain that. EME, MCore, this is one I have on a watch list, but I have not pulled the trigger just because the AI concerns definitely concern me, for lack of a better way of putting it. They beat earnings and revenue. They were up quite significantly, although they did sell off after that. The next one is CRM. This is Salesforce. They beat earnings, missed revenue. They lowered guidance, and they were down a little bit on that news. Agilent Technologies. This is another one I have on a watch list I used to own. They beat earnings and revenue. They were down on the week. Marathon Digital Holdings beat earnings and revenue. They were basically flat on the week, which is actually kind of surprising considering the fact that they're basically a Bitcoin miner. And then the last couple ones was Royal Bank beat earnings, although they kind of issued somewhat shaky guidance. And the same goes for TD Bank. also beat earnings, but again, they issued somewhat shaky guidance going forward. So that's a little bit concerning for the Canadian economy, definitely, that the two biggest banks are a little bit concerned going forward, but I don't think that's necessarily surprising to anyone in Canada. So that is the news from this past week. Like I mentioned at the start there, if you get value out of the video, please like, subscribe, comment, check out those links below. I do have a 10% stock unlock promo code. This is the platform that I use to look at stocks. So again, if you're interested in that, check that out, and stay tuned for more.